the hosts. So my name's Mackintosh. I'm a pre-sales consultant here at Nomios, and I've been with the business for around 2 years. I specialise within email security. But Enrico, you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Enrico. I'm one of the account executives aligned from an abnormal perspective. Been here just shy of 3 years, but prior to that, I did work for other secure email gateway companies for 5 years. So I like to think I know something about email security. So hopefully today will be informative. Pass over to Jake.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So Jake Wardell, I'm one of the senior solution architects here at Abnormal. I've spent probably the best part of a decade and a half working around the cybersecurity industry. A big portion of that in the email space. I've worked at the likes of Proofpoint and Symantec. So I've seen the kind of legacy gateway technologies. Realised there was a better way of doing things, which is why I landed here at Abnormal. So excited to share that with you this morning.
Thanks a lot, guys. So quickly going over the agenda, what we're going to go over. So I'm briefly going to go over who Nomios are, what we're about, just an overview of Nomios in general. Then I'm going to hand off to Enrico, who's just going to go over who Abnormal is, what they do, so why Abnormal. Then we're going to hand off to Jake, which is going to give a demonstration of the platform, and then we'll have like an open Q&A at the end. So Nomios, we're part of a wider group. We're pan-European. We have around 15 offices across Europe. And we work in 3 main pillars, which is cybersecurity, networking, and automation. We are a security networking systems integrator, and we're a services organization at the core. So we have our professional services in which we can stand up solutions in your environment. We have our support. So say you have a lot of different vendors, a lot of different solutions within your environment, and you just want that central one place you can go to if you need help, we can do that. And then we also have our NOC and SOCs, UK based. So we can manage everything from a networking perspective or a security perspective. So this slide is mainly around our approach when working with businesses. So we sort of have that extension of your team approach. I know you probably hear that from a lot of different partners, but we really do have sort of a consultative approach. We want to make sure that you're getting what you need based on your requirements. So we'll always make sure that we're asking you as many questions as possible, understanding your requirements, if that's a business requirement or a technical requirement, and then we'll go off, we'll do an exploration of the market, understand what solutions fit your requirement. So we work with around 50 different vendors at the moment, all sort of top Gartner leading solutions. And if a solution potentially we work with doesn't fit your requirements, we can look out into the market, understand which other ones, which disruptive newer vendors will fit that requirement. Then we'll go on to a bake-off, understand, bring a couple different vendors that fit your requirement, sort of whittle them down into maybe 1 or 2 to go onto a proof of value stage. And at that proof of value stage, we have the capabilities to do it with certain solutions, other solutions we don't, but we'll work with you throughout that. And then we can also help with the deployment through our professional services, and then sort of that continuous management looking forward with our managed services if you need. And then sort of the last bit I was going to go over is sort of our Nomios cyber maturity curve. So this is our story that we bring to businesses when talking about cybersecurity. It's our framework we use to assess the cyber maturity of an organization. So as you can see, there are 3 different phases. You've got an essential, enhanced, and optimized. And then along the right, you've got controls and tooling, security operations, compliance and assurance, and IT controls. So first, looking at essential. So essential is your baseline requirement that any business should have to be secure. Sort of those common controls, which are next generation firewall, remote access, SWG, EDR, email security, which we're obviously talking about today, but I'll bring that around at the end. I'll just go through this story that I'm talking about, and vulnerability management. These are the foundational building blocks of a cybersecurity strategy. And as you go a line down, security operations, when we're talking about management, we're not talking about configuration or management of the solution. We're more talking about are there owners of each solution? And then you also want to make sure that you have your logging, maybe not logging in terms of using logs for malicious behavior, more auditability, understanding if something does go wrong, can we look back into the logs and understand what happened? Then you head down to compliance and assurance. You want to make sure that you're complying with certain compliance mandates. You're doing security assessments on a regular basis, if that's for NIS2, NIS2, whatever it is. And then right at the bottom, IT controls, asset management, asset enumeration is the start of any cybersecurity strategy. You want to make sure you understand what you have so that you're then able to secure it. Then you head on to enhanced phase. So this is no business looks the same at this stage. There are so many different controls and tooling that could fit in here. This is just a small snapshot, and it really depends on what your infrastructure requires. You're looking at more advanced controls based on certain use cases. So things like if you've got a cloud footprint, you maybe want something like a CSPM, a cloud security posture management tool, or you've got an externally facing web server. You may want to have something like a web application firewall or DDoS protection. Really depends on what your infrastructure requires at this point. Then you head down. Now you've got a load of different tools. You want to make sure that you're using those tools. You've got a team looking at them, and that they're detecting and responding based on the alerts that they're firing out. Then you head down to compliance and assurance, pen testing. So prodding at your environment. You've got a good baseline now. You make sure prodding, making sure that you're understanding, assuring that tools are doing what they're meant to be doing, they're actually protecting you, if that's looking at critical infrastructure, whatever it is. Then you've got vCISO. We've got our vCISO practice, in which we can, a CISO will come in, help build up that roadmap with you, looking forward, understanding what your cybersecurity strategy is, what your roadmap is. And then right at the bottom, IT controls. So device management, understanding, are your devices configured up to best practice? Patch management, using the information that your vulnerability management platform spits out to be able to actually push the patches within your environment. Then you head on to the final phase, which is your optimized. So now you've got loads of different tools. You've probably got a SIEM. All your logs are going into that central place. You've got a team looking at them. Now you want to take some time off their hands, making sure they're not getting fatigued from all the alerts, put some automation in place, something like a SOAR. So an EDR can reach into your environment, contain an endpoint, but SOAR builds on that. It can push firewall policies to be able to block a malicious IP to a command and control center, and then also push a password reset to an Active Directory account, whatever it is. Now you've got good protection internally. Now you want to make sure that you understand what's going out on the wild. Something like a threat intelligence platform is really important to be able to understand what is actually going on out in the wild within your industry. Then using that threat intelligence to do proactive threat hunting within your environment, looking for threats before they actually become a threat. Digital risk to help give you visibility around what is happening in the dark web, on the internet, making sure that is your organization being talked about, have you had any credentials put online, whatever it is. And then taking the pen testing a step further, having a full red team engagement, and then also making sure you have that incident response process in place. So that is, very briefly, I went over it quite quickly, the story of the cyber maturity curve, our story of what we believe businesses should go through when going through a cybersecurity maturity journey. But if I bring it back around, head back to email security, and I might be biased here, but I believe email security is one of the most important security tools in the essential phase. Every company uses email as one of their main communication mechanisms, and it's a direct in from anyone external into your business to be able to talk to anyone, any of your employees. So you want to make sure you have some sort of visibility around that. And as Jake was talking about at the start, there has been this huge shift in, it was traditionally malware, secure email gateways would protect against it, but now they've got really good. And now attackers have started to move on to sort of that clear text, social engineering attack, and trying to trick people into doing things. And that is where Abnormal comes in. It sort of provides that advanced social engineering detection. And that provides a nice segue into handing over to Enrico to tell you a bit more about Abnormal.
Fantastic. I'm also not biased, and I think email security is the most important topic that we could possibly talk about. Sam, if I can share my screen, please.
Yeah, of course. I'll just stop sharing.
Thanks very much. I think we're taking questions at the end, but if anyone's got anything, just pop it in the chat and I can answer that after my piece. Just going to do a short overview of what Abnormal is, how we came around. Many of you probably never heard of us before, right? Yeah, we are the second fastest cybersecurity company in terms of growth in history, bar Wiz. But my hope is that we'll overtake them soon. We've only been running about 5 or 6 years, but we're sort of classed as a disruptive technology, right? We're disrupting the secure email gateway market that's been around for about 20 years, right? And the way that they do things, the architecture they've gone for, we're finding that it's not best practice in order to stop some of the threats that are available today. So we'll go into depth around that and show you some examples. But before we do that, Abnormal. We're a modern cloud native email security platform. We're not a secure email gateway, right? You get value from our service incredibly fast. We do these things called risk assessments. It takes about 20 seconds to deploy us in a read-only mode, so they're completely risk-free. We look back 90 days, we run them for a month, and we will show you in the portal every single attack that has made it past your current solution, sat in a user's inbox that we would have identified. This is the reason we've managed to grow so fast, because it's such a non-intrusive test that at the end of the day, we'll share with you, you don't know what you don't know. We were doing a bit of an analysis across 500 POCs we had. We can see the things that are reported. We can see the things that we're detecting. Can anyone guess how many things users actually reported? It's about 6%. So whatever you're being made aware of today via your security teams, your help desk, imagine that understanding all those emails that are being replied to or deleted or not reported, right? It gives you that full visibility of the scale of the problem. Interestingly, majority of our customers come on board in scenario B, right? About 75% of them, they've got a secure email gateway. But now, after a year or two of using the service, about 70% to 80% use scenario A, right? They're decommissioning the secure email gateway. They're relying on Microsoft and Google with Abnormal. We work both ways though, right? You can add us on top as a layer, or you can decommission some of the secure email gateway functionality, move that to Microsoft or Google and use Abnormal that way. It works both ways. In terms of the attacks we're there to stop, let's talk about them, right? We can do the low value, low impact attacks. We can do the medium value, medium impact attacks, right? The reality is, Microsoft or Google should be getting these, or your secure email gateway. We really care about the high value, high impact attacks. And you've probably seen these in some form or another. The text-based ones coming from Gmail or Freemail domains, pretending to be people within the business. And it doesn't have to just be VIPs. Hey, can you change my bank details? Hey, can you give me your WhatsApp number? Hey, can you do this task for me? It's going to pass SPF, DKIM, DMARC. It's coming from a legitimate Gmail. And there's normally no links or attachments. So it's very hard for a threat-centric policy to catch anything from there. Nor would you want to necessarily define anything that says, stop anything with the word WhatsApp in. It's going to cause business disruption, a lot of on-hold messages, things that you have to release. We're trying to take away all that manual labor and automate those things. The second major type of attack that we typically see in third parties that have been compromised, right? Think of all the third parties you deal with as a business. They get compromised on their side, latching onto an existing email thread, just asking you to update payment details. Or maybe they're sending you links within OneDrive documents, or even QR code attacks, if any of you have seen them. You go to a restaurant, you get the menu. First thing you do is you scan the QR code, right? First thing a user does when a QR code pops up on their machine, they scan it with their device. Now, you're probably not protecting that device as you are as much as the network, especially if it's their personal device. We're even seeing attackers use things like Cloudflare or Are You Verify human boxes to stop traditional URL techniques getting through and understanding what that end page is. So we'll break that down and talk you through around them as well. But they're really like the types of attacks. We're also doing things like account compromises and other bits of functionality where we're helping you, not necessarily from a security perspective, but from a productivity perspective. Here are just some of the brands from the last 12 to 18 months from a UK&I perspective. I think we've got about 20% of the Fortune 500 now from a US perspective, just shy of 20% of the Fortune FTSE 100 as well. We're growing. We're very much in the large enterprise, but we're also in small to medium-sized businesses as well. And the great thing is you get the same technology, the same support, the same deployment. We're not going to tier our technology based on how big you are as a customer. And what sets us apart fundamentally is that our team come from the ad tech space. You think, what's ad tech got to do with email security, right? It's just social engineering, getting people to click on links. We take that same similar technology using signal-based approach, and we're looking at upwards of 45 to 60,000 signals per every individual email that we're examining. And what that means for you is that our false positive, false negative rate when fully deployed is somewhere in the remit of 1 in 1.9 million. Now, we're obviously striving to get that higher and higher and higher, but it should very much be a set and forget product. We're also a Microsoft strategic partner, part of their AI inner circle, but we're also very closely aligned to Google as well. They just don't have a strategic partnership program. The way that we connect is via the Graph API. So we're not transport rules, we're not a journaling copy, we're not taking a full copy of your email out of your environment, holding it. This means as well that we can detect signals around internal mail, lateral mail as well, account compromises. Loads of different factors are going into that. And the premise is that we look for normal behavior. We know what normal looks like yesterday, we know what it looks like today, and we know what normal looks like tomorrow. Anything that is abnormal, hence the name, we treat as malicious. We do it by 3 key pillars that Jake's going to refer to. And that's the identity, the behavior, and content. You map out your employees' email, tonality, VIP statuses, devices used, sign-in locations. The list is endless. But unique to abnormal as well, we're also mapping out your vendors and customers. This is an incredibly powerful part of the product because it's federated. So if you and another abnormal customer share a third party, that third party becomes compromised and starts attacking that abnormal customer, we will let you know that is happening, so you can be more proactive in your stance against your third parties, even if it's not them being compromised, even if it's just trying to impersonate one of your third parties, so another customer of ours. We still let you know so you can understand the risk associated with that third party, and maybe you can blend it into awareness training programs. But just having that information from a security perspective is very powerful. Behavioral insights. Does your CEO normally speak to this user at this time, at this frequency, and this cadence? Building that behavioral graph and helping understand how normal business communication happens. And then looking at the content, we're using natural language processing and understanding from that ad space technology to be able to take these plain text emails and know exactly what to do with them. All 3 gives us our abnormal detection score to which we take an action. Now, there's another part of the product as well, which is incredibly valuable for security teams, and that's around reported mails. About 80 to 90% of all mails that are reported are safe, spam, grey mail, right? Users don't know the difference. If you've got a button in your environment, you probably feel this pain. Users love using it as a delete button. You've got to go in, triage, investigate, respond to that user. It's a very laborious task, especially if it's always safe. So what we're able to do is put a more vigorous set of scans. If it's clearly safe or spam, we'll automatically reply to that user, thank them. But let's say we've missed one, right? No one's perfect, and a user's reported it. Not only will we go in and determine it malicious second time around, but we will automatically remediate it from that user's environment and remediate it to anyone else it's gone to, and then update our models automatically because we've missed it first time around. So we're completely automating that triaging process when it comes to reported mails. And last but not least, before I pass over to Jake, right, the risk assessment. So 1-click integration, 0 risk or impact. And all we're going to do is show you every single threat that's made it through, helping build that business case and help giving you an understanding of, right, how well is our current solution doing, and helping build that business case to which you can position abnormal internally. So that's all I wanted to run through. Hopefully that makes sense in terms of an overview. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them, but I'll pass over to Jake now. We'll show you the implementation process. We'll show you the dashboard, and then we'll take questions at the end. Jake, over to you, my friend.
Thanks very much. Let me share my screen. Excellent. We should be all able to see a web browser now. Just give me a nod, Enrico, if that's right. Cool. Perfect. So what we're looking at here is essentially the abnormal platform. As we've kind of touched on, everything is delivered as SaaS. So this will be the single kind of point of contact you will have with the technology. As we go through, what I'm going to step you through are some examples of the types of things that we do see and how we go about detecting and remediating those. The important thing that you won't see in here is kind of policy authoring and rule creation and safe lists, block lists, because actually the tool is doing all of that itself. You're not having to go and author those policies. In essence, the tool is using that machine learning to automatically create the rule set that it's using to detect a malicious mail. When we first came into the platform, though, We're obviously going to give you a dashboarding view. It probably wouldn't be a security tool if we didn't give you this dashboard. So what we're going to do is highlight some of the pertinent kind of stats within your environment. So things like total volumes, trending over time, the types of attacks, and I'll come back to this. But what we'll also do is surface some more useful information for you. How are you being targeted? Is it via links? Is it via text-only attacks? Are we seeing kind of impersonation of names or brands? Are we seeing spoofs? Where do the attacks originate, who's being impersonated, and so on. So when you think about education, you can make sure you're tailoring this to how you're actually being targeted as an organization. If I just come back to this piece here around the types of attacks, really Abnormal is built to detect the full spectrum of attacks. But if we look at where we originally came from, we were originally designed with these kind of more sophisticated attacks in mind. And I'll put that in air quotes because actually a lot of these attacks are very simple in terms of their nature. They are typically text only, but they do rely on kind of social engineering and back and forth engagement to actually meet their kind of objective. As a byproduct of creating a technology to go and detect those really kind of complex and difficult to detect attacks, we will almost always see credential phishing as the largest piece in every environment. There are so many ways and means that a malicious actor can get that past traditional threat intelligence now that actually we see a whole heaps of that getting past Microsoft, Google, or the secure email gateway world. And I can show you some examples of those as we go through. I'm going to start though by clicking into what we call threat log. And this is really where, as an administrator or as an analyst, you'd be able to see a full list of the attacks we've detected. We don't really want you having to spend that much time in here. As you can see down the right hand side, everything's gone to automatic remediated. And actually, we don't want you having to review all of this. So a lot of our organizations that are using the technology have got it very much in a set and forget kind of mentality. They're not spending large volumes of time within the platform itself. But what I want to show you is really what we can surface in here. And there's two attacks that I'll go through within the portal. If I start out, what we're going to look at is a really classic example of a supply chain compromise or a vendor takeover. I'll return to this analysis in a second, but if we start by looking at the email itself, what I can see here, my sender is this person, Lucia Foreman, works for a third-party company called Prolia Systems. Think of that as part of your trusted supply chain, a company you would deal with kind of day in, day out. What the malicious actor has done when they found that kind of existing mail trail is they've looked for something within the mailbox. It actually relates to a payment down here at the bottom. And in essence, they've hijacked that conversation, come over the top and said, look, we're moving to a new bank. Can you change our payment information? It's a really common attack type. We see this playing out kind of day in, day out. But when we look at it, there's a lot of commonality in these types of attacks. There are no links in there. So there's nothing for a threat intel based technology to latch onto and say, well, that's a drive-by download, that's a credential harvester. So it's not going to pick it up in that kind of regard. We do have an attachment. I can actually preview that in the portal as well. But in this case, that is just text in a PDF document. So again, it's not going to get registered as an IOC. And actually, you can sandbox it all day. It's never going to come back as being malicious. When we look at the sending information for this as well, it's coming from a compromised account. It's not coming from a spoof. So it's going to pass all my sender authentication. SPF, DKIM, DMARC are going to be green across the board. So to all intents and purposes, from a threat intel perspective, this is a clean email. And we see these flying past those kind of technologies all day because actually there's nothing in there for them to latch onto. This is where we look at these emails in a very different way. And this really relates back to the slide that Rico showed, where we're really looking at those kind of three pillars of detection. In the background, as we kind of alluded to, we're analyzing tens of thousands of different data points that then bucket into that identity, behavior, and content. If we think about identity, for example, we've seen 1,300 odd emails from that third-party company. We've never seen them sending out of the Netherlands before. It could be that somebody's on a business trip, so it won't be deterministic in isolation, but what it is a really good weighted risk indicator for us. We'll use that as one of the metrics to say, this might be bad. It's very abnormal. Why haven't we seen this pattern before? We then look at the behavior. And actually, in this instance, this will be really the smoking gun. We've got this reply to change. What the malicious actor has done is they've changed the reply to address on this email to this typo squatted or lookalike domain. So Lucia at pro1learsystems.com. Really common pattern with these types of emails. They don't want real Lucia to know she's compromised, but they want to be able to pick up any engagement off the back of this. So this is something that's a real kind of red flag in here. And then lastly, we look at the content. And this is where we're deploying natural language processing and understanding. And what we can see here is we think it's a financial request in terms of its topic, and we think it has an urgent sentiment. As an analyst, I can actually come down, I can turn on text analysis here, and it'll highlight out the key terminology that it's picked up, and it'll actually extrapolate this down at the bottom. So I can see that financial request, we can see the urgent sentiment to it. Together, we know they're likely bad. And when we compound that with the reply to change and the fact that we've never seen that geolocation before, we're pretty confident this is a bad email. That's the point where we then go about doing our automated remediation. So we're going to clean this email out in a timely manner before the user gets the chance to kind of see it or engage or interact with this type of message. So we can make sure that we clean that out and essentially kill the attack before it gets the opportunity to be acted upon. One of the other important things, and this is something that kind of Rico alluded to earlier on, is this additional bit of telemetry we have here called vendor risk high. That actually relates to a bit of technology called vendor base over here on the left. What we'll do is we'll automatically build out this database and kind of understanding of all of the companies we've seen you doing business with, and then we'll attribute a risk level to them. So if we look at this top one, this is the company we're just looking at, that Prolio Systems, we can see it's got a high risk level to it. If I click into that, I'll get more context from that. But really what we're looking at is federating kind of data across your environment, but also other abnormal security customer environments. So if I look at this timeline, anything in red was detected within this environment. This was the email we were just looking at, Lucia out of the Netherlands. Interestingly, 2 other abnormal customers had seen a similar sending pattern. Somebody else has seen another lookalike domain being stood up. This environment's seen other impersonation attacks. That allows us to drive this risk rating up, which then allows us, when we look at emails from them, to essentially put a bit of a stricter check in place. We know there's a higher probability that there's a malicious email coming either out of that environment or impersonating that environment. In the background, we'll also sort of profile things like cadence of communication, when will we expect an invoice to be paid, so that actually we can look for deviation from that within that company as well. And that allows us to really accurately detect those kind of vendor email compromise scenarios. So that's the first example. I want to move into a second example now that, again, is kind of unique to the way we integrate via the API. What we're looking at here is an internal to internal email campaign. The interesting thing about this one, we actually detected this during one of those risk assessments that Rico alluded to, where we deploy the technology in read-only mode, and we essentially just monitor what's going on in the environment for a period of time. I'll again come back to this analysis, but if we start by looking at the email, in the real world version of this, somebody very senior in the finance team had their account compromised. We've anonymized that user, in this case to Rene, but really that account compromise came through an adversary in the middle phishing campaign. Adversary in the middle phishing campaigns are now really kind of rife. They've become the kind of de facto, especially if you think about phishing as a service. And the real kind of crux of the difference with them is that actually it allows the malicious actor to not just pick up the credential, but also the session token once MFA has been sufficed. This is pretty much the exact example that we saw in that scenario. Again, this is a real world one that I've just anonymized, but the emails come in this case, it's come from an iCloud account, so it passes all my sender authentication. The attachment on this email is a very unique HTML attachment. That HTML attachment is preloaded with the victim's email address, so it's going to be really used for this one attack and this one attack only. So it's very unlikely to be registered as an IOC and get detected that way. The other kind of reliance that we often see at the kind of typical gateway layer is they'll try and do sandboxing or link following. What a lot of these kind of phishing as a service campaigns will now do is deploy essentially sandboxing evasion techniques. So in this case, it's actually using capture to break down that link following process. If you manage to follow that through as a human, though, you end up at this reverse proxied version of your 365 login page. So to your end user, it'll have the same graphics, it'll look exactly the same as their normal login, and actually if they put their password in, it'll prompt them for MFA in the same way it would do normally. So that kind of kill chain will allow the kind of malicious actor to essentially just sit in the middle of all of that, and at the end they'll capture that session cookie, which is the important piece. They'll just inject that back in via developer tools and have essentially full access to the mailbox. Whilst we're on the topic of the phishing email side of things, we obviously see a whole host of different types of phishing coming into environments. But just to give you a kind of example as to where we're currently at, we obviously saw QR codes that were really rife last year. One of the things we've seen recently is a pivoting of the QR code itself to actually now being sent as ASCII art. A lot of the kind of other vendors played catch up to try and extract QR codes and be able to actually pass that to work out where does it take you to. So malicious actors have just been playing with how they send those through, and this is one of the latest iterations of that. They send it through as text. It doesn't get passed by anybody, and we see these landing in inboxes all the time at the moment. Because of the unique way that we look at these emails, by looking at kind of the surrounding metadata and the behavior of the email, we don't actually need to look at that QR code to make the determination that this is bad. But again, these are now off-the-shelf phishing as a service type campaigns, and if you follow it through, again, it comes through on one of those adversary in the middle kind of credential harvesters that'll go and pick up all the important details. So I just wanted to touch on those because really they're the cause of why this attack then managed to play out. Once that malicious actor is into my internal account, that enterprise.com account, they essentially look through the sent items folder to try and find the way to get a payment processed in this organization. They realized they needed to email two people. In this case, that's Josh and Zach. And then they just copied and pasted a previous example. So please view the attached to approve this for immediate release. On this, they then needed two attachments. One of those is the invoice. This is actually the real world value of the invoice at the time. We've now seen significantly higher than that. But actually what we tend to find is a lot of invoices kind of sat around the 60 to 100,000 kind of pound mark, because actually it keeps them below a lot of additional layers of scrutiny in finance teams. Malicious actors have done a very good job of profiling where is the kind of threshold for additional kind of inspection. And they often will now kind of sit in that banding to be able to get these through successfully paid in a lot of organizations. This company had tried to put process in place to negate the impact of invoice fraud that said that you actually need to fill in this Excel spreadsheet as well. Because the malicious actors in the mailbox, they've seen that somebody's filled this in, so they simply filled it in and sent it up at the same time. When we're doing these risk assessments, whilst we're not remediating anything, we do get an internal alert if we see somebody engaging with an email. In this case, we saw somebody respond and say, yeah, we'll get it paid in the afternoon. We rang the company, said, look, I'm thinking about paying a nefarious invoice here. They were pretty adamant it was a false positive because it had this attached. So we actually just gave them the reasoning why this was now a bad email. When we're now thinking identity, we're thinking about an internal identity. And what we can sort of see here are really kind of two key bits of information that tell us that this is probably a compromised account. We actually saw a too fast to travel login for this user. So the user, I think they were in California, then about an hour and a half later, they were in Hong Kong. Obviously not possible. Even in the days of Concord, you've been hard pushed to make that work. But what we actually look for is a lot more kind of in-depth information there as well. We'll start profiling things like what is the typical browser that the user would use, what device would they log in from, and then we're really looking for the deviation from that. And we'll use that to say, okay, well, we now think this might be a compromised account. The next thing we actually look at is mail filtering rules. It's incredible how often malicious actors will go about creating a mail filtering rule when they compromise an account. It's one of the first things we see typically when a compromise happens. In this case, what they've done is they've created a rule here in Renee's mailbox to essentially just hide responses from Zach or Josh into the junk mail folder. If I went and compromised Rico's account and wanted to launch an internal phishing campaign, I'd probably create a rule that would just delete the responses to that so that he doesn't know his account is compromised. Very similar to the Lucia example with the new typo squatted domain. If we look at the behavior, we've never seen the company name that was on the invoice before. And again, the language in there is dubious. That allowed that company to actually stop the payment from happening. They very quickly progressed us into production mode. But what it leaves behind is a compromised account. And that's what account takeover here on the left is looking at. Really, we're looking at three key things. It's that signing in data, it's the mail configuration in terms of rule sets, and it's east-west email traffic. If we look at purely 365, it's those kind of three things that we're looking for. We can actually enhance that today by using CrowdStrike's identity module and feeds from Okta. And what we'll shortly be able to do is also take feeds from other SaaS applications. So what we want to be able to do is take those login signals from things like AWS, Jira, Workday, Salesforce, because actually they tell a really good story. Again, if my account was logging into 365 in the UK, but logging into Confluence in Spain, there's a good chance there's a compromise in place there. So it just adds an additional layer of telemetry that we can look at to make a more informed decision. But if I concentrate purely on this 365 one, we build out that profile, and understand, okay, what is normal for the user? Where do they normally come from? Different device, etc. And then we'll look for that deviation from it and build you out a case timeline. We want this to be really accurate because we can then actually either automatically take an action, or we can prompt the kind of SOC team to evaluate this page and then trigger off the action by using this button in the top right. Either way, it's going to trigger off the same set of actions. It's going to sign my user out of their sessions, it's going to block their access, and it's going to trigger off the password reset process as well. So we can contain the blast radius of that compromised account very, very quickly. The last thing to really touch on before I show you kind of how simple this is to actually deploy is that concept of the AI security mailbox. So when Enrico was talking about user reported email, this is the function that we're looking at here. We've all done a very good job of educating end users on what a bad email is, but what that's kind of led to is a bit of a hypersensitivity to being able to go and just click that button to remove an email. People are reporting a lot of safe email that we see within an organization, and what that's tended to lead to is kind of security analysts getting overwhelmed, having to look at all that, either try and reply to it and remediate and triage things, or they don't actually end up replying to it, and we see user engagement drop off. What we can actually do is monitor the mailbox that those messages are reported to, automatically take a second look at them. Because a user's reported it, there's a higher propensity for that being a bad email. So we'll take essentially a stricter check on that message. We'll use the fact that a user has reported it as one of those weighted metrics that we're looking for, and then we'll make a judgment call. If that email is still safe, we'll automatically reply to the user using generative AI to say, look, thanks for reporting this, but actually on this instance, this is a safe email. And we'll actually then give them some reasoning why it was safe. So it's a user you normally communicate with, some of the cadence we expect. They weren't asking for anything suspicious. Conversely, though, if that's a bad email, if I click into this one, we'll go and clean it out of the environment. So as we can see here, the email was originally delivered to 4 people. One person has deemed that to be a phishing email and reported it through. On second check, we've deemed it malicious. So we've automatically cleaned it up for everybody. And that one person that's reported it will get back this generative AI response. So we'll reinforce the red flags to that user in almost near real time to say, look, this was a bad email. And the reasons why were, in this case, bad sender reputation, had some unusual content in there, and the grammar was poor. This will be delivered back to that user as an email, which they can actually then reply to and continue to converse with the AI. So if they ask for additional context or clarity around that, they can get that back from the AI. So if I said, why is poor grammar an indicator, it will give me that additional kind of feedback. The important thing here is as well, you can obviously customize the kind of tonality of that and give it some kind of industry or kind of organization specific information so that it really kind of tailors that message. We've seen some people have some real fun with this. There's a company in the US, a big pet kind of retailer, that are using this to respond just using pet puns as part of the response. So things like goldfish with the PH and so on. So really good, powerful way of getting that end user education, but at the same time also alleviating any of that work from the SOC by essentially taking away that kind of need to manually triage and remediate these kinds of emails. So that's really the platform. The last thing to really look at is how we go about integrating this. And really there's 2 layers to that. Obviously, as you'd expect, we have integrations with a really wide variety of SIEM and SOAR platforms. It's actually wider than we have in the demo environment here. But what we also have is a really open REST API. So even if we don't have an out-of-the-box connector for your SIEM of choice, the ability to pump that data into there via the REST API will always exist. And we see some really interesting kind of integrations and downstream kind of workflows being triggered by the technology. And finally, that just then leaves the really important integration, which is into 365 itself. And this is actually a really kind of streamlined process as well. As Rico says, we can typically do this in a couple of minutes. The process is we would send a link, and then that triggers off 3 steps. Step 1 is some T's and C's, which I won't bore anybody with this morning. Step 2 is looking at the permissions. If we were to do this as a risk assessment, we do this purely in read-only mode. So we're not changing any MX records, we're not rerouting mail, and we actually don't have the permissions to make any changes in the environment. And then we actually just authorize the API. So those permissions are essentially read access to the mailbox and read access to directory and some directory kind of security information. The only real change between this and a production deployment is that becomes read-write, so we can actually move the emails themselves. And then we just simply authorize the API, same way you would do anything to the Graph API. That'll go through. I give it its permissions, and at that point, the tool is in essence deployed. So that's as quick as that process needs to be. What it'll then do is do a historic look back of old email traffic, so we can get a very quick understanding of the types of emails we would expect in the organization. And at the end of a week of it crunching all of its data, we'll come back to you with what we call a care report, which is really an understanding of these are the types of threats in the environment, these are the volumes, and this is really what your risk exposure is. At which point we'll then obviously give you access to the tool as well to continue playing with. And that's really kind of the whistle-stop tour of the Abnormal platform. So I think at this point we kind of welcome any questions or bits of that you want us to delve into to clarify any further. But that is, as I say, as simple as it really needs to be, and it is very much a set and forget technology from this point onwards. So yeah, if there's any questions, we'll welcome those now.
I gathered a couple questions. I believe most of them have been answered, but one I thought of, do you integrate with things like Teams and Zoom, like other communication platforms?
Yeah, so at the minute, what we would do is we would look at things like Teams as an indicator for a potentially compromised account. So we'll be able to look at that and understand, okay, if all of a sudden Rico logs into his Teams mobile app from a beta whilst he's still logging in the UK to 365 from his from his laptop, there's a good chance there's a compromise involved there. What we're currently kind of ratifying and finishing the build out of is the ability to also then scan messages in those platforms.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the next evolution step is we can look for a bad email today, but what we're going to do is apply that same kind of logic and technology to those kind of chat ops type platforms, because actually they're increasingly becoming the risk footprint. As people start to have federated Teams access with customers and so on, all it takes is somebody to compromise that third party, and then I could send an email in and then chase it with a Teams message as that additional layer of kind of validation. I mean, that's a really good way of getting those acted upon. So yeah, it's the next kind of logical step for where we're taking the platform to.
Cool. And then I had another question around training the sort of AI model. What data are you actually using? Are you using the actual emails, the text within it? Or...
Yeah, so we essentially will look at predominantly metadata. So we're predominantly looking at the kind of header information to understand what is a normal communication, who would normally communicate with who, and what is the frequency and the cadence of that. What we'll also look at is then the body text to understand, okay, what tonality does Rico normally use? Does he normally speak in a very formal tone? Is it informal? Does he normally ask for payments to be made? Is he often asking for things like banking details to be changed? So we'll learn kind of all of that. But what we'll also look at is what is normal for that recipient. So if I'm on the receiving end of an email, do I often receive a HTML attachment? Do I often receive QR codes in an email? And again, all of that will get put into that kind of baselining process to understand, okay, what is normal for me, so that I can then look for the abnormality in the emails that I am potentially then receiving after that.
Cool. Yeah, all the rest of the questions that I gathered have already been answered, so that's perfect. Thank you very much, Jake, for the demo, and Enrico for